In 1997, the director's cut of Resident Evil, or Biohazard, was released as compensation for the delay of Resident Evil 2, and this came out just about a year and a half after the original game in 1996. The director's cut introduces two new modes, Advanced and Training, and also re-implements auto-aim back into the game. The original Japanese release of this game had auto-aim, but for some strange reason the North American version didn't. I guess Capcom did this just to make the American version more difficult. But either way, the director's cut reintroduces it. And Advanced is essentially normal, but item placements are different, the characters have different outfits, and there's also new camera angles, which is pretty interesting. Training is basically just an easy mode. It doubles ammo and ink ribbons, and it also increases your health. It's basically just an easy mode. Now this game has two playable characters, but technically three. You have Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine, the two characters you choose from at the beginning of the game, and then you have Rebecca Chambers, who you play as for a bit during Chris's campaign. Both Jill and Chris are accompanied by a partner. In Chris's case, it's Rebecca Chambers, who introduces herself by blasting you in the face with probably first aid spray or something. And then Jill hangs out with Barry, who has probably the best voice acting in this entire game, if we're being honest. Of course, Resident Evil is notorious for its voice acting. I don't want to say it's terrible, because honestly, I don't think that's true. It's definitely charming, I'll put it that way. I think it really does add to the charm of the classic Resident Evil games. And it's something people talk about all the time, whether it's Jill's Sandwich or COD or whatever it may be. I think the voice acting is definitely some of the soul of this game. For the most part, gameplay is almost identical in terms of how the story goes through. Jill and Chris both go to the same locations, but it does play out slightly differently. Like, for example, Jill Valentine can play the piano herself. Chris cannot. He has to get Rebecca to do it. And Rebecca is a little rusty, so she has to practice it a little bit. So you have to just go back and do something else, or go back after doing something else, and then Rebecca's like, hey, I've got it down, which I thought that was pretty cool. And depending on which rooms you go to first, if you go through the east hallway or the west hallway, the story might play out slightly differently. Sometimes you'll meet Barry right where Forrest dies, and he'll give you the bazooka. But sometimes when you go over there, Barry just isn't over there. You can get the bazooka yourself, but you'll meet Barry back on the staircase and he'll give you acid rounds. So sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes Barry will save Jill from like the shotgun trap room, but sometimes Barry won't be over there, depending on which route you take first. And Jill has to go and get the broken shotgun first in order to retrieve it. Of course, if Barry does rescue you, he'll give you the infamous Jill sandwich line, which is always great. So I do think it is interesting that this game does play out slightly differently depending on where you go first. But it really seems like that kind of only happens based on your actions in the Spencer Mansion. Of course, there are multiple endings in this game, and by multiple endings, I mean it just changes the cutscene at the end, and that's about it. But if you're playing as Jill, you can save both Barry and Chris, but if you're playing as Chris, you can save Jill and Rebecca. So I do think it's interesting, but you have to kind of go out of your way a little bit to rescue Jill or Chris, depending on who you're playing, because you have to collect the MO discs. But I managed to get the best ending both times, so that's always nice. In terms of combat, it's very simplistic in this game because you spend most of your time simply just trying to avoid the enemies. You can aim high or aim low, and you do get access to better weapons later on. I will say that Jill's sections are slightly easier because she has access to the bazooka, and you get a pretty decent amount of bazooka ammo. Of course, it's natural to want to save them for the boss fights, like Plant 42 or the Tyrant or whoever it may be. But Jill does have a bit of an easier time. It is not just because she has the lockpick and the expanded inventory space, but just because she kind of gets access to better weapons. I think Chris has more health than Jill, because that's how it felt at least when I was playing through both playthroughs. But overall, Jill is kind of the easy mode of the game, without training at least. Rebecca Chambers is probably my favorite of the side characters in this game. She actually does a lot of the heavy lifting during Chris's campaign. If you get poisoned during the Yawn boss fight, which happens basically when you take damage, Rebecca actually makes her way over, across the Spencer Mansion to the other hallway, and she gets into the safe room, which has vitamins and serums in it, and she manages to cure Chris herself. But for Jill, sometimes if she gets poisoned, she walks over to the safe room herself to get the serum. And then sometimes, depending on the room that you visited early in the playthrough, Jill, just like Chris, will pass out just outside the boss room. But instead, Barry will find you and carry you over. It actually is faster that way. And I think it's interesting too because Rebecca will also create the V-Jolt to help defeat Plant 42. But for Jill, she just defeats Plant 42 with the bazooka or whichever weapon you would choose. And I must say, the hunters are the most annoying enemies in this game because they are very fast and they will swipe at you all the time. And they spawn once you leave the guardhouse and defeat Plant 42. And here's the spiders. They don't really do anything. You can just run past them. But I did think it was interesting though that like you do play as Rebecca in certain sections of Chris's playthrough. I also think the idea of Chris being grabbed by Plant 42 and then Rebecca desperately trying to figure out how to create the V-Jolt serum is really funny in the first place. But I did really appreciate the differences between Jill and Chris's campaigns because it felt just different enough to be interesting. Like it isn't just like a carbon copy and you just swap out the skins. But my favorite part of Chris's campaigns, as I mentioned earlier, was absolutely playing as Rebecca. I guess because it was so different. Like the Rebecca sections are pretty short. All she does is just go across the Spencer Mansion and she'll get a serum, or she'll just walk across and like the guardhouse and just create the V-Jolt serum to use on Plant 42 to defeat him. But I do think it's very interesting that Capcom has these sections in the game to begin with. Like it does help to keep the game really fresh. But in terms of boss fights, for Jill, you just use the bazooka, and it trivializes most of the boss fights, like especially the Tyrant towards the end of the game. And then there's Plant 42, and then Black Tiger. Black Tiger is a giant spider, by the way. But for Chris, his boss fights are a bit different. Like you can just run past Yawn the first time. You can just simply run past it, get the crest. You might be poisoned, but then you play as Rebecca. But when playing as Chris, I just use the Magnum for the most part because the Magnum is a very, very powerful weapon that really does make quick work of most of the enemies. I used it against Black Tiger and even the second Yawn fight and even against the Tyrant. So Jill gets the bazooka and Chris, he has access to the flamethrower, but only like in the underground section. And I do think it's interesting that the Magnum does a ton of damage as well. But overall, there's not much of a difference between Chris and Jill's gameplay. But in terms of combat, though, you spend most of your time simply just avoiding enemies. The regular zombies, when they die, they do not respawn. Some of the later enemies do respawn, but for the most part, you're just going to try to conserve as much ammo as you can. And this game mostly is just about exploration and puzzle solving, which has always been my favorite part of survival horror games. I never really cared for the fighting. I mean, of course, the fighting, you got to keep it action-packed and make it tense, I guess. But I was always far more interested in the exploration and the puzzle solving. And this game does have a pretty good amount of exploration and puzzle solving, particularly when you first enter the Spencer Mansion and you have to really figure out, okay, what is this place? What do these doors lead to, or where do these doors lead? And one thing I've loved about these games too is learning what all the rooms are or where they are and learning the route and just being able to run through the game and beat it in just 2 hours. That's always been my favorite part of these Resident Evil games. I guess the replayability. And my favorite section in this game definitely was the Spencer Mansion. Usually the Resident Evil games have a huge issue where the first setting is really cool and then the later settings are kind of lame. I liked the guardhouse section. I thought it was cool. I liked the Stars lab, or rather the Umbrella lab, I should say. And I really didn't like the underground section, like when you fight the Black Tiger. That's just before you get up to the Stars, or excuse me, the Umbrella lab. I keep saying Stars for some reason. Jill Valentine is a member of Stars, as you know. But I thought the big boss fight with the Tyrant was interesting. So basically, if you're playing as Jill, you rescue both Chris and Barry, and you get them up to the roof. But if you're playing as Chris, instead, you'll get Rebecca and Jill. Like, you have to save them. For Rebecca, you basically just have to make sure that you can save her from a hunter attack when she gets back to the Spencer Mansion. Which is weird because when I was playing the game, that just didn't happen. And I don't know if it was because Chris got poisoned in the Yawn fight and then Rebecca had to go and get the serum for him. I don't know why, but when I was in the Spencer Mansion, Rebecca did not get attacked by a hunter whatsoever. And then she showed up later in the Umbrella Laboratory saying, hey, I can blow this place up. And I thought it was interesting because it helps to kind of keep the game a little fresh. Because I was wondering where Rebecca was at the Spencer Mansion. But for Jill, there's a section where you have to wait for Barry to come back. He's like, oh, I dropped the rope. Oh, I'll be back. And you literally have to wait for like a minute for him to come back. But in order to rescue either Jill or Chris, you have to collect the ammo discs and you have to put them into a computer and you have to open the cell. And you have to kind of go out of your way to do it. Like, it's pretty easy to miss it. But if you want the best ending possible, which literally just means that the cutscene is going to be 5 seconds longer, you have to go get the ammo discs. Here's the final battle with Tyrant. Of course, there's Albert Wesker, you know, betrayer. Albert Wesker. One thing I thought was pretty funny about this game is that Rebecca Chambers, who's a medic, very clearly has like a bulletproof vest on, and Wesker attempts to shoot Rebecca to take her out, and it's very, very obvious that she's wearing a bulletproof vest, and Wesker shoots her, and he's like, yep, see, Rebecca's dead. But in reality, she very clearly isn't. So Wesker just kind of looks like a fool in this game, which I thought was kind of funny. And then Wesker has some of the best voice lines in the game, too. Of course, Wesker's classic is, "Stop it! Don't open that door!" And he says it like exactly like that. It's really funny. This game is an absolute classic, and I love the full motion video cutscenes with actual actors. I think it's really interesting that they did that. But you know, Wesker, the ultimate betrayer and everything like that. You can't trust that Wesker guy. You know, he's up to something. But anyway, Resident Evil absolutely is a classic, and this game's got some really, really great music in it too. I particularly loved the music in the guardhouse. I thought that sounded great. Just avoid the DualShock version when it comes to music, and you'll be alright. But overall, Resident Evil Director's Cut is still a masterpiece. I think this is still a really fun game. This is still just a great game to play. Of course, future Resident Evil titles would vastly improve the gameplay, but I still really do like this game a lot. I didn't really fight the enemies that much because I spent most of my time just avoiding them, and plus with the PS5's like save states and rewind, it really does make this game a lot easier, but whatever, that's just how it is, you know? But as I said though, this game is an absolute classic, and it's going to be interesting to see how the future PS1 games really improved upon this really great formula that Capcom created. So I think this game's an 8 out of 10. I think it's just an absolute classic.